All right, thank you all. So first, just want to say thank you to Kevin for organizing and inviting me, and then also to Yolanda for all of her help getting me here. So I know a lot of folks seem to be embracing a more free jazz aesthetic with a much more improvisatory talk. I'm going to go a little bit further back with the highly arranged syncopated music from the 20s, so I have everything written out here. So I'm going to go with that once we get going. All right, so my paper today goes in a few different directions since I thought it would be useful to provide some historical grounding about the early spread of jazz across Asia, even as I consider the circulation of music and musicians as part of the anarchic nature of imperialism. So in other words, of this past, present, and future of the symposium, I'm going to do in the past part. So my interest in this topic began years ago when I first encountered Bernard Hershey's famous 1922 New York Times article, Jazz Latitude. This is the piece where Hershey sails around the world and encounters jazz at every port. Kevin Flez's 2007 chapter on Asian Americans and jazz, the one he just mentioned, when I read that, though, it made me pay attention to Hershey's piece in a different way. In this chapter, Kevin is in conversation with Francis Wong and notes that Filipino musicians were critical for the spread of jazz in Asia. As I was reading this, I realized that Hershey, too, had casually mentioned the presence of Filipino musicians back in 1922. This idea intrigued me, both because of its complete absence from almost every other story of jazz I knew, and also because the common narratives of jazz as a democratic music of freedom seemed disconnected from this account of jazz spreading through the labor of American colonial subjects. So as a graduate student, I followed Hershey's route by digging through archival sources both in the United States, as well as in Manila, Hong Kong, and Singapore. I spent several years of archival research exploring the Asian port cities of Hershey's trip, such as Yokohama, Shanghai, Manila, Hong Kong, Batavia, Surabaya, Singapore, Malacca, Penang, Calcutta, Colombo, and Bombay. There's just in the archives for most of those, not in all of those places. I scoured newspapers from these port cities, as well as dozens of travelogues, collections of sheet music, and oral histories, among other sources. It was quickly apparent that by the late 19-teens, the sounds of jazz were present almost everywhere there were Europeans or Americans. Whether accompanying explorers in the jungles of Borneo, soldiers in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, or dancers in luxurious hotels along the coast of Asia. And sure enough, almost everywhere I looked, I found Filipino musicians. Instead of merely documenting this phenomenon, though, I found it far more intriguing to try to make sense of this vast imperial economy for syncopated dance music, which in turn led me to take seriously the ways in which jazz appeared as a form of racialized labor. I'll expand a little bit upon that idea here today. In June 1921, the Filipino journalist Ramon Navas, see if I can figure out the correct direction here. The Filipino journalist Ramon Navas posted a report for the Philippines Free Press on Filipinos living abroad. Navas proudly singled out the presence of Filipino performers working in Asia. Throughout China and the South Seas, he writes, visitors tripped a light fantastic to the strains of music by Filipinos. Indeed, as Navas boasted, Filipino musicians were ubiquitous across metropolitan Asia by the early 1920s. From Bombay to Batavia to Yokohama, Filipino musicians were among the premier performers of a wide range of U.S. popular dance songs, generically known across Asia as jazz. Their appearances were so widespread that a decade or so later, the American jazz performer Claude Lapham would observe that, quote, the Filipino musicians almost inundate the East. What interests me about Navas's article here is what he imagines jazz to offer, and how he characterizes this class of Filipino musicians. Rather than emphasizing the possibilities of jazz for aesthetic exploration or artistic expression, Navas describes these performers as, quote, Filipino seekers of fortune, who leave the Philippines behind in search of what he calls big money. He notes their good salaries and encourages others to join them. To Navas, in other words, jazz musicians from the Philippines appeared primarily as a class of workers, as seekers of fortune, vying for positions in a broad, new trans-Pacific labor market in venues such as Shanghai's cabarets, Singapore's hotels, and Calcutta's dance halls. Now this seems to suggest that the real importance of jazz here lies in its qualities as a mode of labor. This was a distinctive form of labor, though. For Filipino musicians, jazz became a kind of work beset with the internal conflict and ambiguities indicative of their experiences, navigating the infrastructures and ideologies of colonized parts of Asia. Before delving into the contradictory nature of imperial jazz labor, though, I'll offer a brief overview of one particular Filipino seeker of fortune, the trombonist Nick Amper. Should I be pointing back here? Okay. I'll figure out how to do this eventually. So Nick Amper's travels demonstrate both how a Filipino musician might move within this imperial jazz economy, and also how his musical labors were informed in part by the contradictory qualities of empire. Nick Amper was born on the central Philippines island of Leyte in 1900. As a teenager, he left to study at the University of the Philippines Music Conservatory in Manila. He quickly established a successful career, appearing both as a featured soloist with the Philippine Constabulary Band and also performing popular music in vaudeville shows organized by the impresario Luis Borromeo. Despite his well-paying position in the Constabulary Band, though, the regional demand for jazz musicians soon drew Amper abroad. Following a brief engagement in Shanghai, Amper was recruited to Calcutta's Grand Hotel in May 1925 as the lone Filipino member of an 8-piece band led by the American saxophonist Jimmy McKean. And I'll play here an excerpt of one of 2 recordings that they released in December of 1925. These are now available on this Harlequin record called Jazz and Hot Dance in India. We'll play about 1.5 minutes, and remember that Amper is the trombonist here. So less than a year later, Nick Amper traveled with Lakeem's ensemble for a stint in Singapore before eventually returning to Shanghai. In Shanghai, he joined an ensemble led by the African-American drummer Jack Carter that featured Amper alongside 6 African-American musicians and possibly 3 Hawaiians as well. Around 1927, Amper left Carter's group for a 10-month tour of the U.S. vaudeville circuit in an all-Filipino act led by the conjoined Godino twins. Amper remained in the U.S. after the tour and moved to Brooklyn. New Yorkers could hear him play regularly with his group, the Manila Stompers, at Chinley's restaurant in Midtown and on the radio station WRNY before he left for Florida around 1938. Amper's career as a musician took him from Manila to Shanghai, Calcutta, Singapore, and the U.S., performing with a mix of Filipino, white, African-American, and Hawaiian musicians. His story is not particularly unusual. He was one of likely over 1,000 male instrumentalists from throughout the Philippines who worked on a contractual basis in hotels, dance halls, and cruise ships across metropolitan Asia between 1910 and 1930. Filipino musicians such as Amper were answering a demand for jazz music sparked at first by the various European communities scattered across colonized parts of Asia. By the late 1910s, white settlers and tourists in the region caused a dramatic change in the leisure industry. As their heightened interest in social dance spurred venues from India to Japan to increase both the size of their dance floors as well as the frequency of their dances. The boom in social dance had a transformative effect on the demand for musicians. And in order to fill the need for performers familiar with the language of American popular music, venues hired musicians from Europe, the US, Australia, and Hawaii. They also recruited performers from the Philippines. This strategy continued the much longer practice of Europeans turning to the Philippines for musicians with intimate knowledge of Western musical practices and who would not demand the wages of white performers. The result was that between the late 19-teens and into the 1930s, Filipino musicians were likely the most ubiquitous performers of jazz throughout colonized parts of Asia. They performed on the cruise ships sailing across the Pacific Ocean, as well as in cities stretching from Honolulu to Port Said. For musicians such as Nick Amper, this string of colonial ports and international settlements offered multiple opportunities for employment. They functioned as both an informal circuit upon which musicians could perform itinerant work, or as sites for long-term or repeated engagements. I thought that for this group, to fill in more the past aspect here, I should add a brief aside that the sounds of jazz were also traveling widely and rapidly by way of sheet music and recordings in Asia, not just through live performers. American popular songs, from Sousa marches to blackface minstrel tunes, had been circulating in colonized parts of Asia even before the Americans came to the Philippines in 1898. The regular sale of Tin Pan Alley sheet music from Bombay to Hong Kong continued as jazz took the place of ragtime and tango. As an example, one of the first references to jazz I could find in Asia was sheet music for the jazz foxtrot Yadi-Da from Earl Fuller's band that was available in a Manila music store in October 1917. As World War I wound down and the production and distribution of recordings resumed, American and European jazz recordings were also available in colonial ports and international settlements across Asia. By early 1919, the latest American jazz records were on sale in stores across the region. The original Dixieland Jazz Band songs were already being transcribed from record to live performance in places like Sumatra. The unquestioned global star of jazz, Paul Whiteman, had records for sale across this circuit by 1921, and his music, as well as records by other white Americans, were relatively affordable and clearly marketed to local audiences as well as English speakers. Tagalog language newspapers in Manila, for example, advertised Whiteman and other American band leaders to its readers. Indeed, similar to much of the world, recordings by African American musicians were relatively rare in Asia until the early 1930s. Whiteman and other white band leaders remained a critical point of sonic reference to audiences and musicians, even as the number of African American performers in Asia began to increase in the final years of the 1920s. In the world of live performance, though, Filipino musicians did not come to dominate these markets for jazz simply because there was a new demand for their labor. Many Filipinos had a considerable incentive to look abroad for employment. The circulation of U.S. products, such as the sheet music and recordings that helped fuel the popularity of jazz among European and American audiences in Asia, was a symptom of imperial trade policies and exploitive business practices that also led to a massive slump in the Philippine economy from 1920 to 1929. This catastrophic shift spurred a dramatic exodus of laborers from the Philippines. Alongside the tens of thousands of Filipinos who found that their best option was to seek agricultural work abroad in Hawaii and the U.S., it's not surprising to find hundreds of musicians seeking better opportunities outside of the Philippines. After all, jazz was commonly presented in the Philippines not as simply a fun music or dance, but instead as a lucrative profession. This was especially true for jobs outside the Philippines. Filipinos stationed across Asia regularly sent news back home of opportunities for musicians willing to travel. For example, Ramon Navas reported from Shanghai about the possibilities for musicians to make what he called good money. He noted that musicians from the famed Philippine Constabulary Band, of which Nick Amper was a member, are, quote, leaving their positions in Manila at 40 or 50 pesos or so a month to come here where they can make at least double that amount, and in dollars too. While surely not all musicians who left the Philippines were motivated entirely by money, you must consider the rise of the migrant Filipino musician at least partly in response to the economic havoc wrought by U.S. colonial trade policies. Another Filipino trombonist, Felipe Padilla de Leon, explained that after working part-time in Manila's cigar manufacturing industry, he turned to jazz as a way to better his life. I decided that I must learn jazz, he recalled. I had to learn it. I needed the money. De Leon's quotation reveals a central tension in Filipino jazz labor. Hundreds of Filipinos found that jazz was not merely a desirable form of employment, but also a necessary one. The two phenomena, the demand for jazz performers and the depression in the Philippines, represent different sides of the same violent and incomplete imperial processes, transforming the economies, labor practices, and leisure activities across colonial Asia. Yet similar to others who faced the upheaval of colonialism, Filipino musicians still managed to find opportunities in these new alignments to establish new markets, networks, and political possibilities. The prominence of Filipinos as performers of jazz across the region inspired a sense of political pride and optimism that had real-world implications. Following the passage of the 1916 Jones Law, which ambiguously promised independence once Filipinos demonstrated they were capable of self-rule, Filipino politicians and others attempted to show to the world in general, and the U.S. in particular, that they had advanced sufficiently, both in terms of race and society, to warrant freedom from U.S. colonial control. Music was one medium through which Filipinos attempted to demonstrate their capacity for independence. The ubiquity of Filipino jazz musicians showed their musical mastery, which in turn was supposed evidence of their civilized status. And I'm happy to discuss further how jazz was racialized in Asia in ways that diverged from the U.S. Filipinos at home began to imagine these musicians as unofficial advocates for Philippine independence. In 1929, for example, a Filipino in San Francisco reported on Amper's act with the Godino twins in the U.S. Amper and the twins were more effective than Filipino politicians, the writer suggested, in, quote, securing incomparable advertising for our country. Journalists such as Ramon Navas expressed a similar pride in Filipino musicians working in Asia. The Filipino troubadours, he observed, have made a name for themselves and their people. By dominating musical markets across Asia, civic-minded Filipinos suggested, musicians from the Philippines became a kind of political force alerting the world to their social and racial progress. This was ambiguous political work at best, however. Across Asia, the logic through which Filipino musical labor became a performance of racial progress was contradictory from the start. This imagined empire of Filipino musicians was enabled through an expansive system of racially based exploitation. Even though the pay Filipinos received abroad might be 2 or 3 or 4 times higher than the wages they might make in Manila, Filipinos were paid less than white and African American musicians. Indeed, Filipinos were well known throughout Asia as possessing musical ability available for low wages. When in 1924, the Macau-based entrepreneur Enrique Valdez floated the idea of establishing a band as a new business venture, he proposed, quote, hiring some Filipino musicians because they were excellent individuals at low cost. Proprietors of venues in other cities employed similar reasoning. It was this combination of musical ability and willingness to work for competitive rates that enabled Filipino musicians to dominate the Pacific Ocean jazz economy. On numerous occasions, they replaced other musicians who demanded higher wages. In Shanghai in particular, Filipino musicians displaced so many better-paid white performers that musicians such as the American Claude Lapham grew frustrated. Lapham complained that throughout Asia, quote, no American nor European jazz band has appeared to give Filipino musicians competition. As a result, he complained, they have become arrogant. This arrogance is at the heart of the contradictory nature of jazz labor. Filipinos dominated the Asian market for jazz to such an extent that by the mid-1930s, Lapham appears irritated at the inability of white musicians to find a place in Asia's jazz scene. Yet Lapham himself does not observe this situation as the result of the racial advancement of Filipinos. It is a result instead of the willingness or necessity of Filipino musicians to engage in labor for a salary that's unappealing for white or African American musicians. Thus, while Filipino musicians chased wealth and fortunes abroad that appeared as a source of pride back home, their success was due both to their musical abilities as well as their status as a racially marked source of competitive labor. Their roles as ambassadors for Philippine independence was troubled by the structures of the imperial jazz economy. For their dominance, the source of their political potential, also perpetuated the very racial hierarchies they were attempting to disrupt. As a brief postscript here, since this always seems to come up, I'd just like to note that the story of Filipino jazz musicians in Asia is often dramatically oversimplified by suggesting that their prominence is due to their unique status as subjects of American colonial rule. I'm sure we've kind of all heard that if we've thought about this subject. Clearly this is important, as I've just suggested, but I'm hoping also to show that we need to understand their ubiquity as part of a far broader imperial economy for syncopated dance music. In addition, we also need to recognize that the emergence of the professional Filipino jazz musician in the 1910s and 1920s builds directly upon specific roots and processes of musical migration that was actually codified in the 1880s when there was the rise of municipal brass bands throughout the region. And that only accelerated with the demand for jazz in the 1920s. And I have a forthcoming chapter on this very topic somewhere else. So I'll leave that at this for now. Thank you very much. What?